All right, so as scholars formulate race beyond the black-white binary, the category of honorary whites has been both informative and elusive. Sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva posits three main racial categories that for the contemporary U.S. whites, honorary whites, and the collective black. Whites and collective blacks represent the binary poles of race and racism. We kind of know that. The collective black in this formulation that he has refers to African Americans, dark-skinned Latinos, Native Americans, struggling Asian Americans, for instance, Hmong Americans, and dark-skinned African immigrants. Honorary whites include Chinese, Indian, Korean, Japanese Americans, light-skinned Latinos, and Middle Eastern Americans. They're minorities who approximate or even surpass whites in terms of their adaptation, in terms of major categories that we measure for how well an immigrant group is adapting to the United States. That is, for instance, median incomes, levels of educational attainment, residential integration, healthcare outcomes, and even identification with whites, right? More so than with other minorities. Bonilla Silva says that they can experience racism, these honorary whites, such as Arab American discrimination post 9/11, right? He goes on to say that they help maintain, basically they're tools for white supremacy, for they exist between blacks and whites and help buffer racial conflict. Okay. But what relevance race has for those classified as honorary whites is unclear, given their significant integration. It's an assertion that he makes that such minorities affirm white supremacy and are racially maligned, rather than an agreed-upon fact. Right? When I'm using the term honorary whites today, I'm referring to his typology specifically. How should we understand the meaning and relevance of race for minorities who approach or even surpass whites along key measures of mobility, seemingly far removed from any substantial notions of racial disfranchisement? Are they a sign of the continued white supremacy as suggested by Bonilla Silva and other critical race scholars? Or is their social, cultural, economic integration a sign of blurred boundaries and assimilation with whites, as others contend? We cannot fully understand how race works overall without understanding the experiences of this growing segment of minorities. I invoke and elaborate on the concept of honorary whiteness in order to offer a more comprehensive approach to understanding such groups. To elucidate how to think of the meaning and relevance of race for this category, I focus mostly on Asian Americans today, whose class backgrounds give them economic privileges alongside middle-class whites. So I'm talking about a particular niche of Asian Americans. And I'm going to connect this notion of honorary whiteness to the racialization of Asian Americans. Before elaborating on the concept of honorary whiteness, I want to briefly explain why I am privileging his formulation of race and racial categories. Other formulations offer many key insights of racial inequality, but less so for minorities that are quite integrated. For instance, Evelyn Nakano-Glenn has argued for a conception of race that recognizes settler colonialism alongside the racialization of African Americans and others. She highlights how displacement and dispossession shape racial injustices, yet how contemporary integrated minorities, for instance Chinese Americans, affluent Chinese Americans, which she references in passing in the article, experience race is not really addressed. Similarly, Julian Go argues effectively that post-colonialism adds to our understanding of U.S. racial inequality, for it provides an historical formulation of race as an imperial project. Here again, the ideal type of a racial minority group is one that experiences clear inequalities relative to whites in the nation, which this honorary white category does not fit. Other frameworks offer definitions of race that allow integrated minorities to be a racialized minority group. Sorry, integrated, yeah. But they're examples of how racism works does not encompass their experiences. Again, for people whose incomes or educational attainments or other measures not necessarily on par with whites, but even surpass white medians. Right? Omi and Wanat offer an approach to understanding race that is expansive, not limited to one kind of racial inequality, but as others have argued, they talk more about how race is constructed than about racism, right, and its relevance for different kinds of groups. None conceptualize a minority category fitting for those who approximate or even surpass whites on key social categories. I'm not dismissing these formulations. I will draw upon them, but they do not approximate honorary whiteness as sufficiently. And yet the conception of honorary whiteness remains under-theorized, with attention mostly to those on the collective black scale of the binary. In what ways and how does race matter for these groups? Right? It's not a self-evident question. Bonilla Silva's discussion of honorary whites paints them as practically beyond racism, for it spends most of its time documenting their achievements. As I mentioned before, he cites anti-Arab American discrimination, hate crimes, and the like post 9/11 as evidence of how honorary whites are not beyond race. But how such anti-Arab discrimination can sit alongside their elevated educational status and socioeconomic status is not explained. Rather than focus on the significance of race for honorary whites, research on the concept has instead studied whether groups classified as honorary whites have racial attitudes more similar to whites and to blacks and such. I'm not going to speak on that because it doesn't really, it's not that controversial, and it basically argues that this notion of honorary whiteness exists. But even with consensus, the so-called honorary white minorities are distinct from other minorities, the more fundamental question of the relevance and meaning of race for them is unanswered. For instance, Asian Americans are racialized as foreigners, but also the out-white whites, quote unquote. And how this can happen simultaneously is not explained. In other words, research has not explained the conundrum of simultaneous white supremacy and the achievements of integrated minorities. Instead, literature responds to this paradox by concentrating on, for instance, Asian Americans' experiences with either discrimination or integration. The tendency has been a debate between two opposing sides, right? One arguing for the significance of Orientalism and race, and the other side arguing for the lack of any kind of meaningful racialized experience. As Lee and Kai put it for Asian Americans in a review article of the literature on Asian American sociology, ultimately we argue that it's time for theoretical perspectives on Asian Americans to move past binary frameworks of assimilation or racialization as mutually exclusive outcomes. So the evidence we have reviewed suggests the possibility and indeed the likelihood that processes of assimilation and racialization are occurring simultaneously for Asian American groups today. So it's not just me telling you this. This amazing review article tells you the same thing. Today I take up this challenge of moving past binary frameworks. I want to briefly review this binary notion in order to demonstrate how race is currently framed for these groups. And then I spend the bulk of this presentation explaining how the concept of honorary whiteness, once properly fleshed out, can help reconcile the seeming binary. So one side of this debate, excuse me, of Asian Americans and race aligns them with the collective black. That they experience a clear racialization as minorities at the hands of whites in the nation, making them connected to the collective black, even as they experience race differently. Such literature explains that they are unlike and unequal to whites, despite their seeming socioeconomic integration achievements. For instance, the model minority stereotype marginalizes Asian Americans and African Americans. Beyond its racist implications, the stereotype hides the heterogeneity of the race. For instance, many Asian Americans experience high poverty rates. Right? Ethnographic accounts of the so-called model minority reveal constant questions of their belonging to the nation. Questions like, where are you really from? Right? Assumptions about robotic personalities and concerns about a glass ceiling. So behind these broad statistical measures of their integration, you see a real experiences of being seen as constant foreigners. The model minority transforms into the Orientalist yellow peril when Asian Americans become too successful and threaten white privilege. The notion that Asian Americans experience racism as perpetual foreigners has been well documented. For instance, they may have residential integration with whites, but are made to feel like they do not belong culturally. as they alter the physical and linguistic landscapes of suburbs. Hate crimes against Asian Americans as foreigners are not uncommon, right? There's multiple instances of this, and we're seeing different versions of this currently. The micro and macro levels of acts of discrimination against Asian Americans affirm the fact that the U.S. is not a welcoming nation, right, but an imperial one with Asians that migrate and work within rather than enjoy the full notions of citizenship. Minorities might move up the racial hierarchy by committing to whitening themselves and distancing themselves from African Americans, but racism still pervades their experiences. Real equality necessitates solidarities between honorary whites and African Americans, which are more common than normally assumed. So one side of this binary, the relevance of race for integrated minorities, contends that they are less economically successful than we assume, less socially integrated and accepted than we assume, and they're mostly treated as non-whites through the lens of Orientalism. They are distinct from, but connected to, the collective black as people of color within a white supremacist nation. Right? That's the one argument, one side of this quote-unquote debate. The other side of the debate contends that Asian Americans are blurring the boundaries with whites, so much so that an assimilation, if not a foregone conclusion, at least would not be surprising. To support this claim, scholars point to major elements of integration. Asian Americans and other immigrants experience more residential integration, interracial marriages with whites, economic mobility, and identification with whites the more time they spend in the United States. So in other words, the challenges they face are a function of their immigration rather than a function of race. When honorary whites live in neighborhoods with a large concentration of co-ethnics, it's mostly by choice rather than a lack of opportunities. There are few, if any, barriers, according to this side of the argument, right, to their socioeconomic equality with whites. A glass ceiling or bamboo ceiling is a very contested notion. There's a lot of evidence suggesting that it's not there. Right? So if race and racism were so meaningful to their lives, you wouldn't see such major indicators. Such arguments do not contend that there is no racism against Asian Americans, but that such acts are not institutionalized, nor impactful at the group level, that they ease over time. It's a crueler version, maybe, of the anachronistic and hopefully harmless stereotype of the Irish drunk. It exists, and it's unfortunate, but doesn't really bear on their livelihoods. Under such assimilation formulations, blacks still suffer from racism, right? Many honorary whites are very close to, if not part of, whiteness. How much race matters to them could be quite little. So we are left with the question of how much race and racism matter for integrated minorities like honorary whites. To get past this debate of whether race matters or not for many Asian Americans, we must adopt a fuller approach to conceptualizing the relevance of race. Honorary whiteness is a useful category to explain this, but it needs to be properly formulated, for it is not clear what the status really means. All right, I hope to accomplish two interconnected goals. The first is to conceptualize the relevance of race for honorary whites. That is, this paper explains honorary whites within a racial system, beyond questioning their individual experiences with racism or other forms of marginalization as normally performed by race scholars. Specifically, I'm going to explain how honorary whites encounter the social structure in a way that undermines the collective blacks and lets them approximate whiteness, while still upholding a white supremacy that keeps them apart. This conception of how race matters for integrated minorities differs from a critical race approach, which argues, as I mentioned earlier, the relevance of race by demonstrating how integrated minorities are clearly disenfranchised relative to whites. In my conception, finding honorary whites to be on par with whites makes sense. The second goal is to use this expanded conception of honorary whiteness to explain how many Asian Americans experience race, and in so doing, reconcile the aforementioned binary debate. Race matters for Asian Americans when their practices and experiences contribute to their disenfranchisement of collective blacks and maintain white supremacy, which will entail proximity to whites but not complete equality. I'm going to draw from existing literature and also offer some data that I've collected.